So, yeah, great, thank you. So welcome everybody to, this is the fourth workshop in the Exploring the World of Open Education workshop series. Not that you have to go to them all, but of course if you do go to all 7 of them, whether all 7 during this AZ Regional Conference or some mixture of the offerings we've had in the past, then you earn your Maricopa Millions, Open Maricopa, OER practitioner certification. So we do encourage you to go to all 7 workshops. If you've missed one and we're not offering it again during this conference, then keep your eyes open and stay tuned, because we will be offering some asynchronous professional development opportunities in the future, which will also align with this workshop series to get you progress towards the badge. I would also recommend anyone, whether you're Maricopa faculty or not, to check out the OER workshop, which is linked down at the bottom right there. That is a self-paced open course that you can use to initiate yourself to the mysteries of open education. There are all kinds of resources in there. It's something that I wrote back in 2013, so it's kind of old, but it nonetheless is still pretty relevant. So I do encourage you to check it out. And it's Maricopa's Canvas, but it's publicly available, so you shouldn't have to log in or anything like that. So yeah, go ahead and go to the next slide. What we also need to make sure everybody knows is that faculty are able to, Maricopa faculty are able to apply for faculty professional growth.
Sorry, Matthew, I'm having trouble.
It's okay. I think you've got a...
Was working before.
It's always the way. Trust us, so don't worry about it.
I'm going to stop sharing real fast and keep talking, and I'll get it figured out.
Okay. So Maricopa faculty do have the opportunity to earn faculty professional growth for this workshop. It's 1.5 clock hours. And of course, you have to fill out the evaluation and assessment within 24 hours. You can find that form on the website, the conference website. Remember, this is part of the Exploring the World of Open Education workshop series. And after completing that evaluation assessment, don't forget that final step, which is filling out the actual form and sending that to your campus rep. So a couple of different cool things going on with respect to this workshop series. But now that we have those logistics out of the way, you want to go ahead and go to the next slide? It'll work this time. Yes. Okay, so this is just a couple of readings that I recommend. And in fact, there's a third one that I'll have to mention too. But the top one there is, I say this at the beginning of every one of these workshops, it's a collection of essays that approach open education from a variety of perspectives. And so it's a really good complement to the series or any investigation of the, open education discipline. So I do recommend that. And then the CARE framework is an article that was published a couple of years back that really tried to propose a framework by which we can evaluate how we are and how others are interacting in the open education space to determine whether or not it's reflective of ethical stewardship of resources. So it's a really interesting article to read as well. And the third thing that's not on here, but you could easily Google it, is the Creative Commons certificate. Creative Commons, obviously, is the nonprofit organization that developed those sharing licenses over the years. And they offer a certificate course. Now, you can pay for the course and take it like a class, but you can also go on their website and access all the course materials for free because they're openly licensed. And so if you want more information about Creative Commons and how that works with open education, then that's another great resource as well. Okay, and at that point, what I'd like to do now is go ahead and introduce Dr. Rudy Navarro, who is our facilitator today, talking about building and publishing OER and experience with faculty developing it from scratch. And he is art history faculty at Phoenix College. Rudy, thank you so much, and take it away.
Thank you, Matthew. And just so people know, I have a big screen over here. So if I'm looking away from you, that's because I'm looking at the big screen. The big screen gets my attention better than the small screen. So, and I also want to let people know that I really came to open education through being a practitioner. I learned as I went along. I have practical knowledge, but I'm going to ask Matthew to jump in whenever he wants because he's really got the conceptual and the theoretical as well as the practical knowledge. So I hope he feels free to chime in as he sees necessary. I want to start here just talking about the value of open education before we get into the resources themselves. As denizens of academia, one of our core principles is the free flow of information. This means information that is free of ulterior motives, whether it be profit or personal interest or the case might be. The only way we can really achieve our goals in academia is to make sure that information flows freely. And that way we can evaluate it correctly, properly, and we can build knowledge. And of course, then the whole purpose of school, at a university, at colleges, is to impart that knowledge to our students and continue the transition. So freedom for open education is highly important. The other thing to keep in mind, especially over this past several months, with the issues of racial and social justice coming to the fore, open education really is a matter of equity and access. Again, education that can be freely shared, that isn't mitigated in some way by some constraining force, whatever those forces might be, whether it be like a highly expensive textbook or a paywall behind which lie the academic journals. We really need to make sure that those things are kept to a minimum. And it becomes an equity issue, obviously. People who have the resources, either the financial resources or the technological resources, as we're all familiar with the technological gap, people who have those resources become the haves, and those that don't are the have-nots. And to the degree that that contributes to racial and social inequities and injustice, we really need to fight that as well. So these values of open education are central to this. And of course, then that leads to open educational resources. And what is an open educational resource? It's any object of intellectual property that can be shared freely. An object of intellectual property is something that you would create. It could be a textbook, it could be a lecture, it could be a video lecture, it could be a test, a learning object, whatever it is you create would become intellectual property. And as an open educational resource, you are committing then, whoever is the owner of that property, to sharing it freely. In the language of open educational resources, we call that an open license. And here at the bottom of this screen, you see the Creative Commons license. That is probably the most common, the most easy way to identify an openly licensed resource. However, as I'll point out later on, that isn't the only way. But the whole point of open educational resources is that they can be freely shared. And what I mean by that, if you look to the right of the slide there, are our 5 R's of open educational resources: retaining, redistributing, remixing, revising, and reusing. If you are allowing your intellectual property to be used in these ways, to be operationalized in these ways, it becomes an open educational resource and then complies with those values of open education you saw before. So today I'm going to talk about 3 things here. First of all, as I said, I'm a practitioner of OER. I'll be talking about building OER from the ground up, but the nice thing is that you don't have to always start from the ground. Hopefully, you will find things that you can revise, remix, reuse. So it makes it a little bit easier for people to work with OER. You can also transform existing materials into OER. For example, I'll talk about my textbook-based classes and how I transform those into open educational resource classes. You can, again, remix, revise, reuse materials, curate existing materials, or you can probably make your own as well to fill in those discipline gaps that the OERs don't actually cover. I'll talk about what this actually looks like using my course as an example. And then finally, I'll talk about publishing an OER. It's I wasn't really focused on this at the beginning, but the more I get into OER, the more important this becomes. It involves licensing, it involves formatting. I never really thought about formatting my stuff for use down the road. And also, there's a technological issue, sort of what platforms you're going to be using, or what platforms and technological platforms you want your OER to be available on. So I'll talk a little bit about that coming up. And of course, with everything we do, hopefully, there's a little planning involved. Unfortunately, we don't always know what we don't know until it's too late. So hopefully, as this presentation might give you a couple points to start with. There's a lot of things I wish I would have known before I began. I have to kind of go back now and fix. But again, like I said, hopefully these things, as we talk through them, will help you out. The first thing I like to always keep in mind is how I want my OER to be shared and how I envision it being used. For example, if I am designing a course or an OER in Canvas, how am I going to have that shared with other parties who don't have access to Canvas or don't even have access to a learning management system at all? How are those Canvas-based materials going to be transformed into something else that can be used by other people? Again, this can become an equity and access issue. Only those users that have the resources, an LMS, and the technological resources to actually use an LMS will be able to access your OER. So you have to think about how you're going to want to share that. Also, as you get going with these, developing your own open educational resources, there's a lot of third-party applications which are very useful, very helpful in building engagement and excitement in a course. But again, they're third-party. So I'm thinking of things like Padlet, H5P, Nearpod, PlayPause. There's a ton of them out there. But again, when I use one of these, I have to think about sharing it. If someone doesn't have access to H5P or a computer, how are they going to actually use this resource that I'm developing? If you are developing a video lecture, how are other people going to be able to use that lecture? And I'll talk a lot about modularizing your materials, but you want to make sure that whatever you're developing, if you're thinking about it into the future, that other people will be able to use it easily, and that will fit very nicely into whatever their purposes might be. And then finally, the license. You might not be thinking about that too much right now if you're just beginning, but at some point you're going to want to license your work. I'll talk a lot about making that license obvious, but people need to know how they can use it. And one of the biggest barriers for me when I find a great resource is if it doesn't clearly state a license, I don't know if I can use that resource, and I have to assume I can't. So you have to be really conscientious about licensing your work. Again, this is something I didn't think about when I started. It becomes more important now as I become a more advanced practitioner. Also, you have to think a little bit about what kind of license you're going to want to use. I like to, with OER, you want things to be as least restrictive as possible so that the 5 R's can be applied optimally. There are some licenses, which we'll talk about, that actually prohibit sometimes some uses. So you have to really consciously think about what kind of license you're going to want to use based on how you want to share it and how you envision your materials being used. The last thing with that licensing and with the materials you publish, it's permanent. As we all become aware over the past several months or longer than that, things that go out on the internet, they are there forever. And if you have a license on something, those materials under that license can't be retracted. They're out there. You can republish something with a new license, but the existing materials with the previous license, that's still out there. So you have to think about that as a little bit as well into the future, what that is going to look like, how that license is going to look in perpetuity. Another general thing to think about is, I like this title, be discrete, not being sensitive, but more being modular, being self-contained. You have to think about your resources as something that is interchangeable, like a building block, like a Lego in the illustration here, something that can be plugged in easily to someone else's course. You want to be able to modularize that content. And what I mean by that, you want to make sure that your objects are focused. They serve a very particular learning objective. They serve a particular concept, a particular image, for example, or a particular object you want to study or talk about. If you have a huge lecture, a 30-minute lecture, when I'm talking about Renaissance art and I go over, a century of Renaissance art, which takes 40 minutes, someone wanting to use that in the future might not be able to use all of it. And they have to spend the time parsing, pulling out what they want. They might not have the ability to do that. They might not have the time to do that. So you want to just keep in mind to have those things as self-contained as possible. I have an example here from my discipline. This is a wonderful open educational resource for our historians, our history. It's called Smart History. Hundreds of videos and essays, scholarly videos and essays that can be used for any level of art history course. But you can see here on the screen grab how their videos are organized. They might take a single image, they might take a single art historical concept, and they would create a resource around that. These essays or these videos take usually about 5 minutes. They're very brief. I use them all the time because they're so easy. If I want to talk about Baroque, I can just come here and find 6 videos about Baroque artists or Baroque artwork or Baroque concepts and just plug them into my course with no revisions necessary. So you want to keep in mind that ability to kind of self-contain, modularize those things. Of course, anything you create should be following best practices, educational best practices. There'll be another slide talking about that in a second. And then very important when designing your materials is to prominently display your licenses and attributions. Again, like I said, I wasn't really concerned about this when I started. I thought, well, those licenses, I kind of get what they are, but I'm not really sure why I need them. I just want to get my stuff to my class. Well, now that I'm doing more of this and I'm looking, researching more, trying to find more, curate more of these kinds of things, licensing and attribution gets to be a problem. If it isn't clearly licensed, the OER practitioner who knows what they're doing will have to skip it. They will assume it's proprietary. They'll assume that it's copyrighted, or I'm sorry, it can be it's proprietary, and they won't be able to include it in their course, or they'll have to link to it. So if you want your resource to be used, make sure it's licensed and make sure it's clearly licensed. I'll show some examples. Well, you can see even here on these slides. All the images are clearly licensed and attributed. And speaking to attribution, if you are designing an OER and you're remixing or revising another OER, you really want to be clear with that attribution. And that attribution should include, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but make sure that license is there. Make sure that people know how to get to that source. A lot of times I will be reviewing a resource. Often I'll see a change in tone, or in my case, an image. Our history is all about images, obviously. I'll see an image plugged in, but the image won't be attributed. So I have to then think, and I know this person wasn't in Florence photographing David, the sculptor David. So I have to kind of ask myself, well, where did this image come from? Can I use it? And if I can't use it, I'm going to have to pull it out of the image. So you want to make sure everything in a resource that you're designing has been licensed and attributed so other people will know where it's coming from. And speaking about attribution, here's some of the best practices. I just talked about conspicuous attribution, making sure things are very clearly attributed. And you can see here, for example, this slide down here, even the images have their own attributions and licensing. Sometimes, and I think I have a slide for this, let me check real fast. No, it's coming up later. Distraction can be a problem. I talked to Matthew about this when we met about this presentation. Because I teach images in art history, I want to make sure people are focusing on the images and not necessarily on the caption. So that's always a design issue for me. There isn't necessarily a one best way to do it, but you want to, again, make sure that your attribution is as conspicuous as possible so that other users will know where the image or whatever the resources came from. When using or when making your attribution, the best way to think about it is this tassel method: the title, the author, the source, and the license. There are some things with source and license to think about. You want to, oftentimes, sources that you pull from will ask to be linked when you attribute them. So it's not just the name, but they also want there to be a hyperlink there. You have to think then, well, if it's a presentation like this or a PDF I'm going to be using, I can't hyperlink it. So then the next thing you have to think about then is to actually include the whole URL. So that's always something to balance. Do I need the whole URL or just the hyperlink? Most sources will require you to make that or to make that link, and most citation practices will require that as well. Anyways, so down here, as you see an example here, you have the source. The title link. You have the author linked, Flip and Yank, and then you have the license itself linked back to the Creative Commons site, which will explain what that license is about. This kind of goes along with what I was talking about with modularity and self-containment. Portability, how your resource is going to be transferred, how other people are going to be able to use it. And you have to also think about, in addition to making your content modular, thinking about the technology. I've already talked a little bit about different platforms, different technologies, making that transformation between one and the other. So this is where portability kind of has to be considered as well. I oftentimes think about other educators who want to use my resources, and I forget about the student. And of course, this is all about the students. We're doing this for the students. And I forget, if I'm using a Canvas page, how does a student download a Canvas page? If they have a textbook, they can buy the textbook, they have it on their bookshelf, or they can download it to their computer so they have that file. But in Canvas, how do they do that? I guess they can copy and paste, my text and put it into some sort of document. But then how would they retain for themselves my video lectures? How do they download a video? How do they retain for themselves my interactives, for example, an H5P quiz or something like that? How would they retain those kinds of things? I don't have an answer for that. Maybe Matthew can speak more to those. I know more to those kinds of things. It's becoming an issue for me now as I kind of progress in my journey here. What are the best platforms to use so that other educators and other students can do this? And I think just last week there was a thread about just this kind of thing. What platforms are educators using to make their products available to people? And there were all kinds of answers that came through on that thread. So even the OER community doesn't quite have this figured out.
Hey, Rudy, if I can, I would just jump in and add one note, because you brought up a lot of really good points there, and I just wanted to kind of flesh out just a little bit. One thing that I would recommend is thinking about file types, and not just the platforms that you're using, but also like how you're actually sharing your files. I think you might have mentioned earlier something about like having a real long lecture, and maybe like, somebody doesn't want to use the whole thing. They only want to use a chunk of it. So like, publishing your materials, like thinking about like a PDF and how like just terrible PDFs are, right? If you want to give your students a textbook and, or if you want to share a work that you've created with other educators who you want to be able to remix and revise, consider, sharing it in multiple formats. I mean, PDF might be easier to open up and just skim through and search for keywords, but if you do intend for people remix your materials, then you should publish a Microsoft Word document or whatever source file that's editable that you can. And similarly, also, depending on context, you might want to think about non-proprietary file types such as OpenOffice or HTML, because those don't have the kind of walls that are erected by the proprietary software companies. Now, we may all be privileged enough to have access to, well, I mean, just about anybody who has access to the internet, right, can create a Google account, right, and use Gmail or Google Docs to open up a Microsoft Word document. But nonetheless, just thinking about, like, what's best for the students, what's best for the global community when I'm sharing my work. And like you said, Ruby, there's no right or wrong answer to it. It's really just something to keep in mind as you're making these decisions.
Yeah, and it's something that, like I said, I am just beginning to think about. I spent so much of my time just getting my resources developed or curated so I could teach a class. I haven't really thought about, down the road. But this is clearly something that as people develop in their practice will become important. Then the last couple of slides here for this introduction, the more you can have your resources follow these educational best practices, the better they're going to be able to be used. You sometimes can actually do open educational resources around rubrics or around models or even assessments. But you want to keep that in mind as well so that people, when they're using the resources, know that these best practices are being followed and they can actually import or reuse or retain something that will follow these practices. Oops, I missed, there it is. And here are the licenses. I think there's a whole workshop on these. Matthew, correct me if I'm wrong, so I'm not going to spend time on this. They're actually still a little scary to me. I've been using them for a while, but I still can't. I was just on Wikipedia the other day looking up a license, and the explanation for the license and how it can be used, it takes quite a bit of time to go through that stuff. So here's an example. These are the licenses here. It will take some time. For me to always figure out exactly how to use them, but at least this gives you a sense of where they're going. And then, Matthew, did you want to go through this checklist? How did you want to use this?
Well, we have some options here. I think that one of the things that we might consider. Do you want to?
I'm going to try to open.
I'll tell you what. I can go ahead and go through this right now, and then we can do the. Then we can go through your slides about your course because it's going to be a good.
Here's the checklist.
Yeah, this would be perfect.
Let me share it again. Sorry. I think we have it. Okay.
Excellent. So basically, what this is a pre-publication checklist that I developed, when I was making this workshop series a few years back. So it's by no means comprehensive. If you can think of things that you would recommend adding to this list, I encourage you to do so because it is openly editable by the public. So anyone can go in there and add stuff to it. And I think that Rudy's probably done a pretty good job, or it seems like he's done a pretty good job of covering most of these things so far in this discussion. And I think you'll see in practice when he shares his course and goes through that, you'll see how some of this is evidenced in there. There are a couple things here that I might recommend that I might just kind of add some additional context. For example, there is a balance between sticking to openly licensed content and figuring out how you get your students access to things that are just freely accessible, and then when it is appropriate to, not necessarily appropriate, but when it's like safe to consider something fair use. We have to remember that fair use is not a right. Fair use is a defense that you use in court when you get sued for violating intellectual property of someone else. So you want to make that decision really strategically, and you kind of have to do a risk-benefit analysis. And I know, Rudy, I'm sure that you'll talk a little bit about that because I know you have some experience kind of deciding, when is fair use appropriate, when should I do this, when shouldn't I? And we are not lawyers, by the way, so if you're in the audience, don't pretend like this is legal counsel. But then the other thing that I would say on this list too, you can read through the list yourself and use it as much as you want, but one thing that we didn't notice is there's the third one from the bottom says, if applicable, I've left gaps in my resource for other users to fill with favorite text of their own. Now, this is maybe something that's real specific for certain literature classes, but I think this does apply across disciplines. The idea is that sometimes the materials, the conceptual materials that you are providing your students are applicable to a variety of examples or models, right? So if I'm teaching my students about, let's say if I have a class on, 20th century American novels or something like that. Well, there are countless novels that an instructor might use to populate the primary texts in that course. Or Rudy, like if you're talking about Renaissance art, right? I mean, maybe there are a few seminal works, but obviously different instructors might pick on, certain details in certain works more than others and that kind of thing. So it might be a good idea to consider how it is that you can focus on certain conceptual details while also leaving open the opportunity for future users to easily customize their materials. And so an example for this might be if you are creating a module and you have a bunch of content in that module that leads up to a final assignment. Well, maybe that final assignment you have created and you've focused that whole assignment around a specific text or a specific primary source or set of articles. When you write that assignment and some of the previous materials, you might want to consider, now this isn't always necessarily the thing you have to do, but you might want to consider writing it in a way so that if somebody decides, you know what, I don't want to use those articles, I want to use the articles that I usually use with my students, but I want to use the rest of the OER material. You want to have it written in such a way that if they replace those materials, it has as little impact on the other stuff as possible. So you don't want, for example, to go in and have to change the personalization of every single content page in your course just because you change one article, right? So you don't want to be too generic, but maybe when you're making an assignment, you can say, refer to the primary readings in this module, blah, blah, blah. That way, we have a separate page where the primary readings are, and that can be customized by the individual instructor. Just an idea. We don't want to overcomplicate things for the students, but again, and this also applies to the idea of not dating your material. Like, don't publish OER that has like your name, your course, your institution's branding, all of that stuff. Now that might be nice to have for you and your students, but if you are intending for other people to use those materials, having it, especially having it a semester and date on it is just, that's a terrible idea. I learned the hard way. The first semester when I taught, I made all these PDFs with I never use PDFs anymore, but I used all these PDFs or created them, and on each one of them it said like fall 2011, English 102. And then I published these PDFs and shared them with my students. I was all excited. And then like the next semester, I was like, oh crap, I have to like remake all of these things because they're already outdated. So avoiding unnecessary detail is actually sometimes a good thing, but you don't want to make it too generic. So it's a balance, again, that you have to strike based on context. That's pretty much all I've got here. This is just a tool for folks to use. So Rudy, if you want, we can just move ahead with your stuff, and then at the end we can ask people what they think about the licenses.
Sounds good. Okay, so I'm going to apply what we presented at the beginning here to my own practice and to my own courses. I have been doing OER for the past 3 years. I have redesigned 3 of my courses, 2 online, 1 in person, to use open educational resources, getting rid of the textbook. And for me, when I first started, open educational resources was all about the free. I got tired of students. I was actually very selfish. I got tired of students emailing me saying, I can't get a textbook, or my textbook won't be here for 3 weeks, or my financial aid doesn't come through and I can't get the textbook. I just kind of got tired of that, and I realized just how difficult it was for students to find the money or have the ability to get these textbooks. So that was my big impetus. I wanted this free. I wanted to get rid of the textbooks so students could access this in a fair way that wouldn't kill them in their pocketbook. Obviously, since then, I have learned a lot more. I'm really much more principled about it. I really value the openness, the freedom, the equitability, the accessibility of open educational resources. But I'm coming from a point of view of getting rid of textbooks. I'm not a fan of textbooks, and I'm not trying to disparage anybody who does use a textbook. I just found in my years of teaching that these textbooks are huge. They don't cover, or they cover too much, to be honest. When I try to teach my courses in a more active way, I just can't get through the whole textbook. It's just, if I really want to teach concepts in depth, I just can't use the whole textbook. So I have gotten rid of textbooks, and I really rely on this modularized sort of approach to my learning content now, and I'll show you what that looks like. It's also a hybrid approach. I use a lot of open educational resources, but I also use proprietary material, which is free to students. It's material that's out on the web that I can link to, but it's not, I can't 5R it. I can't reuse it. I can't revise it because it belongs to somebody else. And I can't publish it on the web. I have to link to it. So I'll show you what all that stuff looks like, and I'll be presenting on that stuff. So the first thing I learned right away when I working with open educational resources and with anything you're doing in your classes is time and effort. It always takes a lot more time than I thought it was going to take to do something like this. I'm talking about redesigning a course or even just curating materials to get ready to redesign a course. It takes a lot of time. So I'd encourage you as you get started to be aware of that. Don't bite off more than you can chew. If I am redoing a course, and I mean by curating new content, designing new assignments, maybe developing my own OER, I have to give myself the same amount of time as it would take to teach the course, to design the course. So it's a significant expenditure, and just be aware of that. The other thing to be knowledgeable of at the very beginning is a basic understanding of copyright and these licenses. I'll talk a little bit more about that coming up here. So I'll talk right now. It took me a while to learn the licenses, to become familiar or have to get a working knowledge of these things. So don't be afraid when you're starting off that, oh my God, I don't know what these licenses mean. I can't do this. No, get going and kind of learn as you go along. The big thing I learned right away is if something isn't explicitly licensed as open educational resources or open access, it means it's all rights reserved. It's hands off. Now, you can still link to it, but you really can't publish it. I do a lot of online teaching, and I do a lot of my home learning materials online for my in-class students. The moment you start publishing things to the web, that becomes a publication, and you start running into copyright infringement issues. If you're doing something in the classroom, maybe a slide and a presentation, it's a little different. But once you start publishing things to the web, you're actually making unlimited number of copies, which becomes an issue. So if it isn't explicitly licensed as open access, I skip it. I don't bother with it. Matthew mentioned a little bit about fair use. I don't really know what that is. I've done some research on it. I read through court cases and synopses. I read the synopses of court cases. I don't want to get involved with it. And I mean, if you're into that kind of stuff, go for it. But if it's not licensed for open use, I just skip it, or I link to it.
Hey, Rudy, do you mind if I jump in real quick and just provide one little note? So, yeah, the thing, I didn't want to scare people away from fair use either. I mean, the truth is that I actually, a while back, had the exact same approach that you do, or that you just articulated, which is if it's not clearly licensed under Creative Commons, or if it's not in the public domain, then I'm not going to include it in the OER material that I plan to publish, right? Because I can't remix and revise that thing. Now, that, again, doesn't mean that you can't link your students to it. So you can still use it in terms of linking, but you can't exercise 5R permissions on a material that is not Creative Commons licensed or in the public domain. However, I was corrected, I guess, in a sense, or at least encouraged by some librarian friends to never forget that fair use is a legitimate defense. I mean, it is a real thing. I mean, it's in the Constitution. It's not a right, but what it is it basically says, you know, there is public value to, like, social value to allowing certain kinds of use of intellectual property without the permission. Now, you can't reproduce a New York Times article in your Canvas page, but you could probably quote it and have no problem defending that as fair use. Think about Wikipedia. Wikipedia pages, as far as I know, Wikipedia has not been sued and taken offline. Almost every Wikipedia page has like all kinds of quotes from proprietary all rights reserved sources on it. And that's fair use. And Wikipedia pages are licensed under Creative Commons. So just keep in mind that just like as a regular person writing a movie review or somebody remixing sampling a song, you're a content creator when you're making OER. And whether you put a Creative Commons license on the thing you're producing or not is irrelevant to your fair use of someone else's intellectual property. So again, it's that risk-benefit analysis, thinking about whether or not what you're doing would constitute proper fair use. Now, we have a separate workshop on fair use. It's already passed this time. It was part of the copyright workshop on Wednesday this week. But there are tons of great resources about fair use out there. It's not super easy. It is gray, but it's worth investigating. So that's all I wanted to say.
Cool. Thank you. So when you're looking or curating sources, open educational resources, the easiest, and this is why we emphasize the conspicuous attribution, it's so much easier if the Creative Commons license is up there. Not all open educational resources, though, or open resources, have that license. So, for example, I'm showing you here on the screen a page from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You have to kind of dig down into their terms and conditions page. I circled here their copyright and proprietary rights section, and they have their own designation for open resources. They call it open access, and they outline here on this page that if you see an image with this OA on it, that means you can use it. You can do the 5 R's to it, all you want to do, everything, publish it, reproduce it, retain it, all that kind of stuff. So as you start curating your materials, keep that in mind. Not everything is going to have a Creative Commons license. Some things will have a little section which you have to drill down and find, but it's still open licensed. And I give the Met kudos because they have obviously an amazing collection and they've done a lot of work to make their images available to the public like this. Another example, literally in the fine print, this is a website that I found some articles on, which are wonderful articles, and I thought, shoot, I really wish I could publish these onto my page. Let me do a little digging. Again, no Creative Commons license published here, but if you go to the fine print, as they say, you can see right there a copyright that we're free to copy, distribute, and transmit everything, as long as we attribute it. The other thing to keep in mind when you find something like this is these sources might have some restrictions on how they want you to use their resources. So, for example, with the Met, they state, I think I blocked it out down here, but they state that you should attribute the Met in a very particular way. It's the Met Museum, and then provide the hyperlink or the URL for the Met Museum. So they do have some requirements for attribution, so make sure you check those things out. But again, the little take home here is just because it isn't conspicuously licensed with Creative Commons doesn't mean it's not open access. You just have to do a little bit of digging. And that, like I said, fair use. Yeah, I'm very careful with that. There's more than enough for me out there that I can link to. That I don't really have. I'm not too worried about having to actually reproduce it to my pages or to my class. Now, I use this license. It's an attribution, non-commercial, share-alike license. However, as I've been reading and thinking about this, I think I might actually make my licensing less restrictive. Like I said, I've learned a lot about the principles of open education, and the less restrictive information is, the better. And even though it's a Creative Commons license, it's open access, these non-commercial and share-alike things do add some restrictions. A share-alike license means that if you use this material, you have to use it in the exact same way, with the exact same license as the resource states. And Matthew, start correcting me here if I'm wrong. So that can cause a problem if you remake something with a different license. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty here, but be aware. I'm actually thinking of changing my license to just an attribution, and even in that case, I'm thinking to myself, do I really care if people know my name? I might just leave it, public domain or just a CCO, something like that. But think to yourself how you're going to want to use it. I do. One person who presented about her resources uses a non-derivative license. I have a problem with non-derivative license. That means that you can use this, but you can't change it. So you automatically gotten rid of one of the R's, or a couple of the R's. You can't revise it. In my case, well, I don't want all of your article. I just want part of it, but I can't do that. I have to take it all or leave it. So in my mind, it kind of limits. It kind of goes against this open access idea. She had an excellent reason, though, for doing it that way. She teaches some controversial subject matter, I guess, and she wanted to make sure that everything she had in her resource was taken in context. She didn't want anything pulled out and taken out of context and then possibly used in a negative way. That makes a lot of sense to me. I can see why she wanted to do that. So again, these things aren't always cut and dried. You have to kind of think it through a little bit. Here's an example of how I might license something. You know, I use a lot of images, which are, I have a whole database of images now because I have to catalog them essentially. I'm a little librarian now with OER. So this artwork is obviously in the public domain. It's 2,000 years old, so it's clearly out of copyright. But the image itself might not be. So I have to make sure that the image itself is in the public domain. In this case, it's a MET image, and they've already told me that I can use it. Even their website says it's public domain, so it's not even an open access license. It's just public domain altogether. But you can see here I have my caption with the title, author, of artist, all that kind of stuff, and then I have my image source down there. There's the Met Museum. I've hyperlinked it here, and then provided the license under which I'm able to use that. And again, you have to consider if the hyperlink would be better or the whole URL would be better. I think I have an example. Yeah. Here's a case where design becomes an issue. This is off another page that I use in one of my other courses. This image is open access. I got it off of Flickr, and the user said that I could use it. I have the it's a CC non-commercial by license. But you can see down there that the attribution, if I put a hyperlink there, if I put a URL, is 3 lines long, full of all that kind of gibberish. And so part of me is like, oh my gosh, that just looks horrible. And if I really want students to be focusing on the image, how much does that URL detract from it? So this is what I'm talking about. It's kind of a balance between design and use and practicality, and then attribution and licensing. If I put a link there, it'd be a lot cleaner, obviously. But if I'm publishing in a way that you can't link to it, then you have to put the URL. So you have to kind of keep that in mind.
Hey, Rudy, this is a perfect opportunity to address the not side conversation, but the note from the chat earlier about this exact thing. So Cody mentioned that he was told in an accessibility workshop to not include URLs in text because it's bad for screen reading devices.
Yeah.
And that may very well, I don't actually know for sure. I mean, I don't doubt that. In fact, it makes perfect sense. I wonder if there's a technical way to resolve that situation in terms of accessibility. But I would say with respect to this example that you're showing right here on the screen, this is a time when I would say nobody wants to see that URL, right? That is so much junk in that URL. In fact, some of the junk I'm not an expert, but some of that junk might have to do with your search that you did in the browser history. You know, and so sometimes the issue is not necessarily. Sometimes it's like finding the stable URL, or you know what I mean. It's kind of like when I teach English, research methodology and citation. You know, students are like, well, should I include URL? And if the citation style requires it, typically it requires it only if it is a stable URL and not like something that has all this information about like your IP, your browser, or whatever all the back end information is in there. So keep that in mind too. And you can always say something like this, by the way, the URL is great if you, you know, obviously if necessary, then put it in there. But sometimes you just have to play around a little bit, and you can say like, you know, this is available via Flickr, and then you can just, instead of linking to the specific image, you could link to the author's Flickr page, which is not necessarily going to be as, you know, ginormous a URL as this. But yeah, I totally agree. This is something that I would be really frustrated if I felt like I had to have the caption underneath my image.
Right. Well, great. Yeah, thanks for that, Matthew, because I'm learning here right now, as a matter of fact. A lot of these sites, I know Google does this, it's great because they actually provide you the attribution link, and the attribution link, something they provide, looks like this. So I guess knowing a little bit more about exactly how this works, the technology behind this, can actually, you know, help out a whole lot when it comes to formatting and designing your page. So yeah, thanks, Matthew. I know there's an example here of how my licensing looks. This is a video lecture that I produced, and then I just license it, my name, and then the CC BY non-commercial share alike license. Pretty simple there. And then in this case, the license, you can't tell from here, but the license itself is hyperlinked. So if someone clicks on the license, it goes back to the Creative Commons page that explains the license. As I was saying, I'm kind of a hybrid user of OER. I use as much OER as possible because I can retain it. I can download it to the computer. I know it's always going to be there. So I try to make the majority, as much of my class be that, so that I can control it. There's nothing more frustrating than having designed a great lesson around a video clip or something, but then the video clip goes away, and you have to redesign the lesson. So OER, is definitely the way to go there. But I also use materials from the library. You see the image in the middle there. That's from Films on Demand, which most of our libraries have license for. And then the image on the far right is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They have a wonderful essay series on the history of art, very concise, short essays, but scholarly essays on different topics, and highly modularized. It's proprietary, so I can't just copy and paste into a page or something, but I can link to it. So with these three different kinds of materials, I'm able to build quite an interesting course. Let me kind of see if I can. Yes. As I was saying, I really try to focus on the permanence of an object. So open educational resources are the best. This is an example, again, that's of a smart history essay and then a video lecture that I produce myself. Those things are the best to use. They're always going to be around. The next best thing are things that usually are available through your library, that your library licenses. Obviously, they're proprietary and they're not free. They're free to students, but they're not necessarily free to the college. But the nice thing about these things, you can usually talk to your librarian and say, hey, can you make sure we have this stuff because I use it in my class? So it's usually a little more stable than something that's just free range on the internet. Now, again, I try to use sources that are pretty standard in the discipline. For example, the Metropolitan Museum of Art is not going to go away anytime soon. They might change some of their resources, but it's pretty stable. I'm pretty sure it's going to be around for a while. But again, this is proprietary. I can't publish it. I can't reproduce it or publish it, but I can link to it. The other thing that OER is great for is actually activities. This is the first time I tried this. I think we refer to it as open pedagogy, where the activity is having students actually contribute something to the lesson, as opposed to just following the instructions and coming up with something. They actually design the lesson or they design the material. I came across this little OER essay on drawing. You see that on the left. I wanted to use it in my class, and I decided, oh, it's just not enough. There's too many links are dead, and too much of the information is sort of outdated. I just can't use it. And I thought, wait a second though, this would be a great activity for students to do some research on. So because it's open educational resources, it was openly licensed, I could copy and paste it, and then I could change it. So on the right, I turned it into a Google Doc. I highlighted certain areas, and then in the comments section, I told students, find an image by Leonardo da Vinci, or explain or find a finished work of art on the something like whatever the case might be. And then students would take this and they would start adding the content to this Google Doc. So the Google Doc became something they were learning from, but also it could become a resource for future classes. Of course, as was pointed out the last time I talked about this, you want to make sure students give you permission to use their research, again, keeping it open, attributing things. So you want to make sure the students know that what they're going to be contributing will get used, and give them a chance to opt out of that or opt in, depending on how you want to frame it. But this was a learning experience for me. It was a great way to use something I couldn't use because it wasn't complete enough, and turn it into a lesson that students could participate in and actually build something on their own. Another example of, and let me see if I can show it to you. Another example of a learning object are some of my video lectures where I use a third-party lesson or application called H5P. Let's see if I can find it here. Here it is. Okay, this is one of my Canvas classes. And show humans as they might behave in the real. This is a lecture I produced. And H5P allows you to take a lecture excuse me, that you create and then add interactivity. It could be, for example, a caption. It could be some pop-up questions. I use those all the time. I don't have an example in this video, but I use those all the time where students will be watching the video and maybe halfway through, I'll throw a question on the screen. And students have to answer to check to see if they understood the concept, check to make sure that they're paying attention, that they're still engaged, something like that. Also, H5P allows for these things called accordions. So after your lecture, if you want the students to have some additional information or to repeat the information that was in the lecture, you have these little accordions here, which will go over in more detail what was talked about in the lecture itself. So this is another example of using a third-party application to design something, and then this whole thing would be licensed as CC BY or whatever license you would want to use. Oops. Okay. I love a multimedia approach, multimodal kind of approach. Like I said, I got rid of the textbook. I don't like textbooks. They're just too much information, and a lot of times information isn't what I want, or it's just, I can't teach to it. So I try to find things that are very targeted. So I will use videos. I will do lectures. I'll use videos. I'll do text. I'll do videos that I produce myself. I'll use that, create those H5P activities. All those things I put together into the course to kind of create this multimedia kind of experience. Again, sorry, I keep going back and forth here, but there's no other easy way to do it. An example of what one of my pages looks like. So this is a page on Renaissance art. I have my lessons, or I'm sorry, my proprietary essays here. This is something from the Berkshire Encyclopedia of World Art, licensed to the library. This is again from the Metropolitan, an external website, which is linked here. And then using an open educational resource from Smart History, which I showed you, I'm able to embed that video here. So students then have a kind of multimedia lesson all of a sudden. Text that I write, video they can see, and I don't know if I don't have an activity here, but I might finish all this up with some sort of learning activity, a little quiz or an H5P activity, something like that. And I was going to say something, okay. And Smart History does a great job of attributing their stuff. If they're licensed, I can just go in there, copy and paste their attribution line and their license right there and plug it right up onto the on the screen. This is a great example as well of modularity. I could just go right to Smart History, find what I wanted, get the embed code, put it right there in the canvas, boom, done. Now, I do have some information on student preference. Like I said, I use this multimedia approach. On one of my classes, actually, I did this for 3 semesters, did a little bit of research on what students liked best. One week, I think it was like week 8 of the course, I broke the lesson up into 2 formats. The first format was this multimedia approach where I had open educational resources, videos, essays from different sources. And the second week of the course, the second half of that week, I PDF'd a portion, hopefully fair use, of the textbook that I would have used in the course. I then asked students which they preferred. I did this for 3 semesters. I think I had about 63 students respond. I asked them which format they liked best, which format kept their attention, and which format they think they learned more from. And you can see here the multimedia OER format. 55 students liked that best compared to 4 with a textbook. 55 thought that format, the multimedia format, kept their attention more. And 52 students thought it was easier to learn, or they learned more from this format than the textbook-only format. Not that textbooks are bad, but just the textbook-only format. Some things that students, oops, that's not going anywhere. There we go. Some things that students, I then asked them why. Like, as in, provide some comments, tell me what you thought about these things. I did a little thematic analysis of what they told me, and 16 students thought that the videos assisted with their learning. They had various reasons for that, but the general theme was that videos were conducive to learning. 10 of them liked the mix of reading and video. They thought that held their attention more. 8 of them preferred their shorter readings. Again, if you think about a textbook, finding a chapter, 30, 60 pages, whatever the case might be, can seem a little daunting at times. So a text that maybe takes 5 minutes to read, or a video that takes 6 minutes to watch might seem a little bit more doable. Students seem to like that shorter format. And then other students thought the online accessibility was more enjoyable and more accessible. So that's the overview of my course, how I kind of implemented OER. Matthew, do you have anything else you want to add or mention here?
Well, no, I would just say, just speaking for myself, I love the way that your course is designed. I think it's probably a really great experience for the students to go through it. Like you said, that multimedia approach and having everything fused together like that. And one thing that I also really like is just how, the different examples that you gave of like licensing and attribution demonstrate one of the challenges, which is like kind of thinking about like, well, okay, how am I supposed to use this particular material that I find online? And because in some cases, like you said, you kind of have to dig around. It's like that website, there's an investigative journalism site, award-winning, ProPublica. ProPublica is actually Creative Commons licensed material, but it's not really clear. You kind of have to go into like the how to use our work page.
Exactly.
And you have to kind of peel back a little bit and see. But that kind of does like. Are you gonna? Do you want to talk about the data before I go into the licensing thing? I just noticed that's on the screen. Okay, we'll go ahead and do that now. Yeah, that's fine. Let's do that. And then I just wanted to keep in mind. So I guess before Rudy does this talking about the results, I just want everybody to know that at the end here, we've got about 27 minutes left. And for the last like 10 minutes or maybe 15 or even I don't know how many minutes, but for the last chunk of it, I would really like to engage in a discussion with those of you in the audience about the different Creative Commons licenses and which license you would end up preferring, you think. So just keep that in mind, because that's the discussion that we would like to have. I'm so sorry, Rudy, for...
Actually, Matthew, I had no more data to present, so I was done.
Oh, you're done. Okay. Well, let's sorry. Okay. Well, in that case, you want to go ahead? Let me go ahead and share my screen, because then that way I can go straight to the slide that I think we need to be addressing here.
Can you?
So I'm going to ask that everyone in the audience here, please feel free. We don't have that many people here. I think we only have like 18 people here, so it's not going to be, this isn't going to need a breakout room, I don't think. Feel free to either use the chat or even just turn on your microphone and share your thoughts. But my question is exactly what it is on the screen right here. Which of the Creative Commons licenses would you prefer sharing your work under? And so just again, to remind everybody about the context, Rudy mentioned the non-commercial share-alike license, that he likes, and even though he might be considering using a different one. He mentioned someone else who likes the no derivatives license, those that do not allow for remixing and revision, but nonetheless do provide you the right to, the permission to share with your students and to keep a copy and all of that. And so, what do you think? I mean, I can tell you the license that I use on my materials is the attribution share alike. So I'm not as concerned with the idea of people using, my materials for commercial purposes, but that's just my own, I guess. I'm just not too worried that somebody's going to take my, thesis statement exercise and make a bunch of money off of it. But I do like the share-alike license or restriction because it does kind of guarantee that when someone else is going to use your work and adapt that work for some reason, that when they publish that adaptation, they can't put more restrictive licenses on it. And likewise, they can't loosen the license either. So, for example, somebody could, if I wrote a textbook or whatever and I published it with an attribution share-alike license, if someone took it and adapted it, they couldn't then put a no derivatives on it or then put a non-commercial on it, otherwise tightening the license up more in the future. But that's just my thoughts. So what do you think? Just jump in. What are your thoughts?
Matthew, do you see Alicia's comment in the chat?
Yes, I do. So that's the share-alike license. Textbooks, so they need to be printed and sold deluxe. Okay. Yeah, actually, so just to be clear, just to clear up one misconception about the non-commercial clause or restriction. So actually, the non-commercial restriction applies to the use of the material and not the user of the material. And so if the purpose of printing the textbook is if it's being printed and sold like at the bookstore at cost, or if it's a print on demand service, or even if it's being printed and the printer is making a profit off of it, but the use of it is non-commercial, then it's still okay. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but I am sharing with you, there are 2 court cases that were actually resolved, and that was the interpretation of the non-commercial license. So what happened is that a company called Great Minds was making open educational resources. And it was in New York, I think, and they created these OER and they released them with a non-commercial license. And then a school district that was using those resources, so a public school district, using the resources for a non-commercial purpose, which is to educate the students in the public school district, had those materials printed out at OfficeMax. So OfficeMax did a publishing for them, right, the printing, and OfficeMax upcharged, right? I mean, they made a profit off of that because that's their business model, right? Because it's a printing shop. So so Great Minds took them to court, and the resolution of the case was that Great Minds lost the case. It was actually that the use was not commercial in that case. The use was non-commercial. It just happened to be that there was. So that it's a little bit tricky because like what ends up happening is that we have to see the non-commercial restriction not as no money can be involved at all, but specifically like is the use of the material that. So it can be tricky when you think about the bookstore thing, whether or not you want to have a low-cost option printed off. If you have a required material that's an OER, that's a print version at the bookstore, that's being, charged additional for, that could be complicated. So I do see that potentially, but I would just be aware that there are other ways around that. And of course, students can always have the materials printed out on their own. They can always do that without a problem. So anyway, but again, I'm not a lawyer, and for more information on that, actually, remember how I mentioned the Creative Commons certificate course? If you actually go to Creative Commons and you go to their certificate course materials and you look at the section that talks about the different licenses, you will find some really interesting background information related to those court cases. So thank you for bringing that, because that's a really good point.
Matthew, I have a question. Is there a case, what would be an instance of someone using it commercially, but still keeping in mind the open education values? Is there a case where someone would actually want to sell something, but still make it, free information? I mean, it's kind of
well, that's a complicated question. I mean, that really goes to, it really depends on. Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for all open education practitioners in any way on that, because that to me is really a personal values thing. The extent to which you are one is supportive of something along the lines of homework platforms that are themselves not openly licensed but use open resources in them. So if you have something like, it could be a product made by a publisher, or it could be a product made by a tech company like Lumen, where they charge the student for access to, not the materials themselves are openly licensed and available for free on the web. And so when the students pay for a product like Waymaker, or if they're using Cengage's, Open Now, something like that, they are paying for not the materials themselves, but they're paying for the platform in which the materials are being delivered. So it's like assessment tools and all this early alert system and stuff like that. Now, I'm personally not a fan of that stuff, but some people really, really like them, and they're used in a lot of cases to save students money. So there's I have no intent to disparage that use. It kind of depends on, who your students are and what you think is going to be best for them. I'm the type of person that thinks, we should try to get the cost down to zero and avoid those things.
That's why I use a non-commercial license. I don't care. Well, I do care if someone makes billions of dollars off what I did, but I'm more concerned with the students. Like, I don't want someone charging students for something that I thought was free. So that would be the only reason I would use a non-commercial, unless there's a situation I'm not thinking of.
Well, no, and it would be that kind of thing. Here's the thing about these licenses too, and this is just an extra little bit of detail for those of you in the audience who weren't at the workshop yesterday, which got into some of the weeds of Creative Commons licensing. But one of the things to keep in mind is that you can grant people additional permissions if you release something under a Creative Commons license. What you can't do is release something under a Creative Commons license and then add additional restrictions. So what that means is, if you do release something with a non-commercial restriction, you can grant an individual or an individual organization the permission, just on a one-by-one basis, to use it for a commercial purpose. So, for example, if you release something under a attribution non-commercial share-alike license and you publish that material on the web, and a publisher comes to you and says, hey, we want to use that in a textbook that we're going to charge for, and we're going to pay you money for it or not, or whatever, then you can actually give permission to that individual publisher to do it. You're just not giving blanket permission to the world. So that's an interesting thing, too. Putting a non-commercial license on the material that you publish may be a way to safeguard against the kind of commercial exploitation potential, but at the same time, it doesn't keep you from, granting those permissions individually if the opportunity or the situation arises when you think it's justifiable. And no matter how convincing I sound, I'm not a lawyer. So let's see. What do you think about? There was a question. Cody's question is above about public domain. I agree, Rudy, with what your answer. The answer is, if something's in the public domain, you are not required to attribute in any way. Like, you can, we all can, if we want, go find a novel by Jane Austen and take it and republish it with some extra chapters about zombies and call it Pride and Prejudice with Zombies, which is a real thing that happened. And they even made a movie out of it. So the thing is that works in the public domain are up for grabs. You can literally do whatever you want. There are some publishing houses that specialize in publishing works that are in the public domain because they don't have to pay any royalties to anybody. And you, as a human being, are able to do whatever you want with works in the public domain without attribution. However, you want to avoid plagiarism. There's a difference between properly attributing a source and or not, and plagiarizing. Like, if you're trying to pass it off as your own work, that can be problematic just ethically, not necessarily legally. Like, Mark Twain can't sue you because you claim authorship of Connecticut Yankee at King Arthur's Court. Nobody can. But you are certainly acting unethically, and people, it might be bad for your career because people will be like, well, this is a crazy person saying that they wrote this novel that was written by somebody else. So keep that in mind. I guess the short answer to your question, Cody, is no, you do not have to attribute materials that are in the public domain, but you probably should, because as Rudy said, you want your reader, you want your audience to know that it is in the public domain, so that they can actually, be aware of that too. But it becomes a question of whether or not you need to put it in caption or not. If an image is in the public domain and you want to avoid having a caption on a slide, you can put those captions at the end. I see that happen a lot, where it's like, there's a bunch of images in an open presentation, and when you get to the end, there's a slide that says images are public domain from Unsplash or whatever, and which is fine. I mean, that's just basically saying this is where all these images came from.
It's also useful for other practitioners, like I said, because when I'm looking at a source and it's open educational research, it's licensed, but then there's the image there, and they don't tell me where they got the image from or how that, then I'm like, well, is this image okay? Is this image also licensed openly? Or so it's nicer if the image itself is attributed and licensed separately. In a caption or something. That way I know, oh great, I can use this. Or gosh, I may take the image out or replace it with one of my own.
I think that is a really, really great point, because again, it's kind of like how do you intend for this thing to be used? If you're creating it and you just want to make the slides pretty for your students, then it's public domain image, whatever, just put it on there, doesn't matter. But if you're going to share it with other educators, or if you anticipate other people remixing your material, which is kind of part of the point of doing this stuff in the first place, then I would say absolutely, just like what Rudy said. Great point. I'm wondering if there are any other thoughts about this. Are there situations in which you would, like individual situations in which you would prefer one over the other? Because I know myself personally, one of the reasons why I landed on the attribution share-alike license was because when I was developing some materials one time, I was drawing from Wikipedia pages that were related to rhetoric and stuff like that, which are really, really good pages. In fact, more concise and kind of better than almost any rhetoric textbook I've ever seen. So I was drawing a bunch of stuff from Wikipedia, and Wikipedia's licensed attribution share-alike. And so because some of the materials that I was remixing were from Wikipedia, I was obliged. I didn't have a choice. I had to publish it as an attribution share-alike because that was the original license. So sometimes you don't even have a choice, like in that case. Yeah, job security is always important. Yes, seeming the least, thank you, Cody, like it being less intimidating to others who want to use your material, right? You're really encouraging others to use it while at the same time making sure that you're always, kind of connected to it as an author. Now, I know some people, this is kind of what Rudy brought up earlier, but, some people like the no derivatives because of the fact that if you do put a no derivatives restriction on your material, while it is technically not OER, because you can't change, others can't change it and build upon it, it could nonetheless be shared with other students as is, when there's nothing wrong with that. But you would have, you're able to maintain that academic integrity, or you're able to maintain, or as a creator, just creative integrity. If you think about myself as somebody who is an educator, when I'm making materials for my classes, that's one thing. But then if I'm like writing my novel, I'm having a hard time I'm debating right now, like if I'm going to put a Creative Commons license on my novel right now. And I'm going to get into it. But the point is that like it's a different circumstance. Like when it comes to a creative or artistic work, you may feel like as an artist, you are maybe less inclined to let others remix your work freely if you want to maintain that artistic integrity. Now, again, that is a personal decision that you have to make based on how much sharing you want to do. So this is why I want to try to have this discussion, or at least try to force everybody to think about it. Because I think as Rudy made pretty clear, and I think I just articulated as well, there's not one way to do this. This is all about what you think's best for your context and what you think's best for your students.
Matthew, if I can, I want to try to answer Jolie's question.
Sure.
Yeah, is it okay to publish, or how about contemporary art images? Yeah, contemporary art sucks when you're trying to publish that stuff. It's still under copyright, obviously. You can go to sites like Flickr, and there's a couple of other sites where individuals have taken photographs of some of this artwork. Unfortunately, if you ever try to photograph art, it's a highly skilled practice, and so a lot of times these photographs aren't very good, but at least you have them. But again, not all contemporary art is going to be documented that way. So contemporary art's tough, and if you're trying to photograph, or if you're trying to use a time-based medium like a video or a film, forget it, because there's no such thing as an individual who photographed a video that you can use. In that case, you just link. I've seen a lot of contemporary art resources that just link to images. They will link to the image at a museum website or something like that. They won't even try. They're not going to try to publish them on their own site.
And one other thing I would point out, as we're waiting to see if anybody else has any questions, I would point out that the most restrictive license, which is the non-commercial, no derivatives, just so that we're clear, is still better than all rights reserved for obvious reasons. I mean, TED Talks, which some of you may be familiar with, are potentially really great, conversation starters in a course, in a variety of disciplines, right? And so you may have seen a TED Talk or heard a TED Talk or something like that. TED Talks are all licensed, non-commercial, no derivative, which means that as a practitioner, as a person, as a human being, you have the right to download the TED Talk from the TED Talks website, re-upload it. You could upload it to your own YouTube channel if you have a course YouTube channel, or if you want to embed it in your website or whatever it is. You're permitted to do that. You're allowed to redistribute. You're allowed to retain a copy, and you're allowed to reuse it with your students. So it's still really good. You're just not allowed to cut it up. You can't, clip parts of it out and use it out of context or whatever. You have to keep it as is. But so that's the other thing to keep in mind too, is that even if by certain definitions of OER, those with the no derivative restrictions, those licenses aren't open, those are still good, potential educational uses of material that do give you permissions more permissions than an all rights reserved license would. So I don't see a lot of activity. Actually, I see zero activity in the chat at this point. So I think what I'm going to do is interpret that as we're all ready to enjoy the rest of our Friday afternoon. Although I will tell you, if you're Maricopa faculty, you should check out the Maricopa International. There's a special webinar that's starting in like 7 minutes or whatever, about what it means to be Afro-Latino. It's a really great webinar series. So if your Friday is over, that's great. If not, then check that webinar out. It's not related to this conference, but it is a Maricopa event. And other than that, I would say thank you all for being here. Be sure, if you're applying for FPG, to do the evaluation and assessment and get those forms in, all that stuff. And I will see you all around. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Rudy, for taking charge. Awesome.
Thank you.